This year is our 100th birthday anniversary, and we're very excited. And in that context, I even have the more distinct honor of welcoming you here to the 2017 Edwards Public Lecture Series, which focuses on improving minds through behavior and brain science. And in particular, tonight's lectures are going to focus on how studies of the brain enables us to better understand how we, children and adults, can become more resilient to the impact of adverse situations such as trauma and stress. Now, before introducing the evening's lectures, I do want to say a few words about how these lectures came about. If you've been here before, you know that this is really a truly exciting lecture series, and this has been made possible by the generous donation of the family of one of our former faculty members, Alan Edwards. And he was a faculty member in our department for half a century, for 50 years, and he's most well known for his contributions to making, I think, that a lot of the psychological science more quantitative by introducing very rigorous statistical methods to the science that we conduct. Now, the Edwards family contribution to the psych department is an example of what can be accomplished then with support from members of the community, such as each one of you in this room. And as outlined in our pre-lecture slideshow, improving minds through behavior and brain science is one of our department's new visions that we hope that you will want to be a part of. And so I invite you to join our efforts and become one of our Friends of Psychology. And you can easily do that by just going to our website. And I want to thank those of you who have already done that. Again, very much appreciated. Okay, now what I'd like to do is introduce our first speaker. Now, it's really quite an honor for me to introduce my colleague, Dr. Kate McLaughlin. Dr. McLaughlin received a joint Ph.D. from Yale University in clinical psychology and chronic disease epidemiology in 2008. She arrived here at the University of Washington in 2013, coming from Harvard University, where she was an assistant professor. Her exceptionally high record of accomplishment and impacts in her field put her on a pretty fast track to promotion, and she was promoted with tenure as an associate professor only a couple years later. Now, Dr. McLaughlin's research studies how environmental experiences will shape emotional, cognitive, and neurobiological development from childhood through adulthood. She is particularly interested in how adverse environments alter developmental processes and how this impacts one's risk for psychopathology. Her goal is to prevent the onset of psychopathology in children who experience adversity. Now, Dr. McLaughlin's research is supported by a large number of federal and private foundation grants, such as the National Institute of Mental Health, National Institute on Minority Health and Health Disparities, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, the Jacobs Foundation, the Charles Hood Foundation, the Brain and Behavior Foundation, and many more. She has received an impressive number of early career awards, such as the very prestigious APA, or American Psychological Association, a Distinguished Scientific Award for Early Career Contributions to Psychology. And she has received other career awards, for example, from the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies, the Jacobs Foundations, and the Society for a Science of Clinical Psychology. Her over 175 publications are also highly recognized in the media, as you may have seen her or heard her in NPR, in the Times Magazine, in the New York Times, Seattle Times, and again, many, many more. So again, without further ado, let me introduce my colleague, Kate McLaughlin.
Thank you for that very kind introduction, and thank all of you for being here. So we live in a world where children are routinely confronted with extreme sources of stress and adversity, ranging from displaced children in Syria fleeing war, to children affected by the growing famine in Somalia, to children right here in the United States, millions of whom are living in poverty. And today what we're going to talk about is how those experiences of stress and adversity impact children's development, particularly how they impact the way the brain develops, and ultimately impacts children's chances for success in life. So I want to start by giving a few examples of the kinds of children that we work with in my lab here at UW. So I want you to imagine Michael. Michael is living with a father who has a drinking problem. When he's drinking, he often experiences rage that's unpredictable. And in these episodes, he will hit Michael and the other children in the family, as well as Michael's mother. So Michael is living in an environment that's characterized by unpredictable and uncontrollable threat. Now, in contrast, imagine Sarah, who is being raised in an environment that's relatively safe, but that's lacking in cognitive stimulation, complexity, and interaction with adults. So Sarah's family lives in poverty, and because her mother has to work multiple jobs to support the family, she's often cared for by older siblings or teenagers in her neighborhood. Now, the experiences of Michael and Sarah might appear to be atypical, but our work has actually shown that they are remarkably common among children living in this country. So what you can see on this graph are data from a nationally representative sample of over 10,000 children in this country. And what the numbers are showing are the prevalence rates of exposure to different types of environmental adversity, ranging from things like losing a parent or having your parents get divorced, being raised in a family where your parents have a substance use problem or there's domestic violence, to more serious indicators of maltreatment like abuse, neglect, or living in chronic poverty. And although the prevalence of each of these individual experiences varies, what we've found is remarkable, which is that more than half of all children in this country will experience at least one of these events by the time they reach adulthood. And obviously these statistics are not confined to the United States. We know that currently about 250 million children are living in countries that are affected by war, and about half of the entire world's population who lives in extreme poverty are children. So these problems exist around the world, not just in the United States. And this is concerning because we know that exposure to these kinds of experiences is a powerful predictor of your mental health later in life. So what you can see on this graph are the number of those adverse experiences a child had in that large nationally representative sample. And here it's showing you the odds that they went on to develop a mental health problem like anxiety, depression, or substance use compared to children who had never experienced that adversity. And you see this very strong relationship between the number of adverse experiences a child had and the likelihood that they went on to develop a serious mental health problem, with children here at the highest levels of exposure being almost 5 times as likely to develop a mental health problem by the time they reach adulthood as children who have never had these kinds of experiences. And we know that these effects are not confined to childhood, but that they persist throughout the rest of the life course. Here what you're seeing is something that's describing the proportion of all mental disorders that start in the United States. What proportion of those are explained by exposure to those adverse experiences I showed you just 2 slides ago? And another way of thinking about these numbers is it's the proportion of mental health problems that we could theoretically prevent if we got rid of adversity or were able to prevent the downstream consequences of it. And what you see is that almost half of all mental health problems that start in children in this country are attributable to exposure to stress and adversity. About 1/3 of mental health problems that begin during adolescence. But strikingly, we find that about 1 in 4 mental health problems that start in adulthood here in the United States are explained by exposure to stress and adversity in childhood. So what explains these associations? Why is exposure to stress and adversity such a powerful predictor of psychopathology? And what are the mechanisms that explain that? So what's going on developmentally? And this is really the primary research question that we study in my lab here at the University of Washington. And specifically, we're interested in understanding how experiences of adversity influence the developing brain in ways that may ultimately place children at risk for developing mental health problems later in life. So to study this question, we rely on a tool called MRI, magnetic resonance imaging, which essentially uses powerful magnets to measure different aspects of brain structure and brain function. And so I'm going to show you a lot of data from something called functional MRI. Where essentially we use this magnet to try to measure the amount of blood flow in the brain. And the idea is that when a particular region of your brain is active, the neurons start firing more, and blood flow to that region of the brain increases. And the MRI can measure that signal, changes in blood flow that we think represent changes in how many neurons are firing in different parts of your brain. So you're probably familiar with these colorful maps of the brain. fMRI, or functional MRI, is what produces these colorful maps. And I'm going to explain a little bit about what these maps are actually showing. So for example, this is a study that was conducted by a grad student in my lab named Matt Peveril. And this was a fairly simple study where children were asked to look at an image that might have looked something like this and to remember where the stars were located in this array. Sometimes there were 2 stars, and sometimes there were 4 stars. Now, when we analyze the data, it produces this colorful map here. And what you're seeing here is the comparison of when children were trying to remember the location of 4 stars relative to 2 stars. And so the way that we interpret this are the regions that you see colored here are regions of the brain that are active when we're trying to remember something, when we're trying to remember it over a short period of time, something that we call working memory, as these were regions that were more active when you have to hold more things in mind. So I'm going to show you a bunch of maps throughout this talk that look like this, and you can interpret them as meaning regions of the brain that were more active when kids were doing a particular kind of mental process. But the kinds of maps I'm going to show you were designed to examine how experiences of adversity influence brain development in children. And so what I'm going to do for the rest of the talk is walk through some of the work my lab has done on 2 particular types of adversity. One of the messages I want to leave you with is that not all adversity is created equal in terms of how it impacts brain development, that we actually find distinct patterns among children who have been exposed to different types of adverse experiences. And I'm first going to talk about our research that examines children who grow up in environments that are characterized by threat. So think about the example of Michael that I showed you at the beginning of the talk. Michael is being raised in an environment that's highly threatening. So you can think about children who grow up experiencing abuse, children who are growing up in families where there's domestic violence, children growing up in war-torn regions like Syria or South Sudan, or children who grow up in communities where there happens to be a lot of violence in that community. We know that about 1 in 5 children will experience violence by the time they reach adulthood, and that many, many more children around the world grow up in these kinds of threatening environments. So what I'm going to show you is that growing up in this kind of a threatening environment influences brain systems that are involved in emotional processing in ways that help the brain to rapidly identify other threats in the environment. This is a very adaptive response to being raised in an environment that's characterized by danger. So threatening experiences influence regions of the brain that help us identify threats and learn how to predict them in the future. This involves regions that I'm going to tell you about, like the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the prefrontal cortex. And I'll describe those regions a little bit more as I start to show you some data. So let's get to the data. I'm first going to show you some research we've done in my lab examining how exposure to this kind of threatening early environment impacts the way that the brain responds to emotional information. So in this study, we looked at children who grew up in families where they experienced abuse, physical or sexual abuse, and children who had never been exposed to violence. And I'm going to show you what the children saw when they were in the MRI scanner in this experiment. So some of the time, they would see a cue that simply told them to look at the image that we were about to show them. And then we showed them images that might have looked something like this. Some of them were negative, showing negative emotions. Some of them were positive, showing positive emotions, people being happy. And some of them were totally neutral. Although I like to think in Seattle, once I moved here from Boston, this is not a good example of a neutral image. Okay, so here's what happens in the brain when you are looking at emotional images. This is in the entire sample. What you see is that when kids were looking at negative images, you get activation in a set of regions known to be involved in emotional processing, like the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the medial part here of the prefrontal cortex. Just to orient you, when you're looking at the brain here, this is the outside of the brain. These images here, or if you took the brain and sliced it in half this way and opened it up, this is the back of the brain, this is the front of the brain. And you actually see that the pattern of brain activation is really similar when you're looking at negative images and positive images. And that's going to be important in a second when I show you where we found differences in the brain when, as a function of whether or not kids grew up in a dangerous versus a safe environment. And here's what we found. So specifically when children were looking at those negative images, we found that kids who had been exposed to violence had much greater activation in this region of the brain called the amygdala than children who had never been exposed to violence. Now, the amygdala is a region of the brain that helps us to identify threats in the environment and to learn about when they're going to happen. You can kind of think of it as an alarm bell that tells us when there's something really important that we need to pay attention to, especially if there's something dangerous around. And the way that you can interpret this is that these kids who have experienced violence are finding those negative images to be much more salient and much more potentially threatening. Their brain is saying, this is potentially dangerous, you really need to pay attention to this. And that makes sense, right? This would be an adaptive response if you were trying to scan the environment for danger in order to stay safe. But we also found that this difference was not just confined to the amygdala, but it actually was in a whole network of brain regions that help us identify salient cues in the environment. Areas including the anterior insula, the putamen, and the thalamus, all of which help us identify things in the environment that we need to pay attention to. And so this suggests that negative emotional information that could signal the presence of threat is highly salient to these kids, and their alarm bells are going off much more strongly than kids who have never experienced violence. Now, when we looked at differences in their responses to positive emotion, we found something very different. And in fact, we found no difference whatsoever in how they were responding in the brain when they were looking at those positive images. And this indicates that kids who've been exposed to violence are not just more reactive in general, they're not just more kind of emotional in general, but rather that the effect is really specific to cues that could predict the presence of danger. And critically, what we think is happening is that the brain is adapting to the environment that these kids are being raised in, and helping them to identify threat as rapidly as possible so that they can stay safe. In that same study, we've also examined how kids are able to kind of modulate or regulate their responses to emotional information. So, the world would be a very different place if we all walked around just, expressing our emotions without thinking first about the context we're in or whether we should really say that to our boss. And so we're constantly kind of thinking about how to respond appropriately and modulating our emotional responses to be appropriate for our current context. So we were interested in what's going on in the brain when children are trying to regulate their emotions. So some of the time they would see a cue while they were in the scanner that would tell them to try to decrease the magnitude of their emotional response to a cue that might have looked something like this. And some of the time they saw cues that asked them to try to increase or magnify their emotional response to a cue that might have looked like this. Now, how did they do this? So before they got in the scanner, we taught them to engage in a really effective kind of emotion regulation that's called cognitive reappraisal, which is a fancy way of simply saying, thinking about something in a different way so that you change the way that you feel about it. This is actually a technique that we use very frequently in cognitive behavior therapy and other evidence-based treatments for mental health problems. So in this study, we taught the kids when they were looking at negative stimuli to try to kind of make it distant from them, to imagine that it was far away, that it wasn't real, that the people, the situation wasn't relevant to them. And when they were looking at positive stimuli, we asked them to do the opposite, so to immerse themselves in the picture, to imagine that it was real or that it was happening to them. And the thing that is fascinating is that when we try to regulate our emotions in this way, you can actually measure changes in the amygdala in the brain. So when we try to regulate our emotions, we're using this area in the front of the brain called the prefrontal cortex. This is an area that helps us to plan, make decisions, and to control our thoughts, our emotions, and our behavior. It's kind of like the CEO of the brain. And what you can see is that when kids were trying to reduce the intensity of their emotional response to these pictures, you see that the amount of activation in the amygdala goes down. And we think this is pretty cool. You can actually measure how your brain is responding differently when you try to think about a situation in a different way to reduce its emotional meaning. So the kids were, on average, reducing their amygdala response when they were trying to regulate their emotions. So how does exposure to violence impact this emotion regulation process? So what we found is that the kids who had been exposed to violence were recruiting these regions in the prefrontal cortex that we know were involved in this task to a much greater degree than kids who had never experienced violence. So the way you can think about this is, you remember that I just showed you that these kids are having a much stronger amygdala response to negative images. They're reacting more strongly. So the idea here is that it might take more cognitive resources or effort for them to try to dampen down that emotional response. It's harder because there's a lot more reactivity that they have to modulate. But we think that this actually might make it more difficult for them to use emotion regulation in the real world when things are stressful, or they're distracted, or there's a challenging situation. So emotion regulation is kind of more cognitively or challenging or effortful for them. But one finding from the study that I think is incredibly positive is that although these kids had to kind of use more cortical real estate to do this effective emotion regulation, they were just as successful at reducing amygdala activation as kids who had never been exposed to abuse. And this is really promising because these are the kinds of techniques that we use in therapy for kids who have experienced trauma. And the idea here is if we give kids effective strategies for regulating their emotions, they can do it. And I think this is an incredibly positive message about the plasticity of the brain, even after extreme forms of adversity. So like I showed you before, there were no differences whatsoever in how the brain responded to positive images, again suggesting that the brain is changing in ways that are specific to the environment that children have experienced. Threatening environments have a specific effect on threat processing systems in the brain. So you may be wondering, was it really necessary to collect all this fancy brain data to show that kids who've been exposed to violence are having stronger emotional reactions to negative cues? Couldn't we have learned that in other ways? Well, in fact, in that same study, after each trial, kids, while they were in the scanner, provided a self-report rating about how strongly they were feeling about each of the images. And here's what we would have found if we had simply looked at their own reports of how they were feeling. We'd have found no differences in how they responded to negative cues, whether they were simply looking at them or trying to decrease. And in fact, all we would have found is that they found those neutral images, like the coffee cup, to be slightly more emotional, which really suggests the value of using these more sensitive measures of brain development to understand how environmental experience is impacting children's development. So we've also seen that this heightened vigilance and heightened reactivity to threat that children experience after exposure to violence has downstream consequences on other aspects of learning that I'm going to tell you about now. So specifically, I'm going to talk about one recent example from my lab where we examined children's ability to learn about contextual things in the environment. Cues all around us, like being in this lecture hall, that tell us where we are in space and time. And this is work that's led by a graduate student in my lab named Hilary Lambert, who I think is in the audience somewhere. So we frequently use contextual information to guide our behavior and our emotional responses. So a very simple example is that you would respond very differently to a gunshot if you heard it at an airport versus if you heard it at a shooting range. Just a very simple example of how we're constantly using the context in which we're in to guide our behavior and our emotions. And one of the things that we often see in kids who have experienced violence is that they have a hard time contextualizing kind of where they are. They might continue to exhibit persistent fear, even in contexts that are safe where they've never experienced violence, like at school, for example. And so we were interested in studying this process. How does exposure to violence influence our ability to use the context around us to guide our emotional responses? So in this experiment, while children were in an MRI scanner, we showed them pictures that looked like this. They were pictures of faces that were embedded in realistic background images. Some of the faces were neutral, some of the faces were angry or threatening, and some of the faces were happy. Now, while the children were in the scanner, we didn't ask them to focus on the background context at all. In fact, all we asked them to do was pay attention to the face. They would see the image, it would disappear, and then they got asked a question. Another face would appear, and they were simply asked, is this the same person that you just saw? So at the time, kids had no idea that they were supposed to pay attention to the background. And that's kind of important because context is something that happens in the background of more salient cues. And as soon as you kind of ask people to focus on it, it's not the background anymore. So the kids had to kind of not realize that we were interested in whether or not they were encoding this information that happened in the background. And then, when they got outside the scanner, we gave them a surprise test. So this is about an hour later. This is the first time they realized that they were going to be asked about whether this sort of background contextual information that these faces appeared upon. And specifically, we asked them to say whether they had previously seen this person in this place. Now, you might think, that seems really hard. You didn't tell them to pay attention to the context. Could they do it? And it turns out they could do it pretty well. So chance would be 50%. And you can see that the kids are performing much better than chance on this task. That about 2/3 of the time they're able to get it right, even though they didn't know that they were going to be tested on this contextual information. This kind of speaks to this sort of implicit processing of where we are in space and time that we're always engaging in, even though it's not a very conscious or explicit process. Now, while the kids were encoding those faces embedded within scenes, this is what was going on in their brain. Now, in particular, they were utilizing this region of the brain, this posterior part of the hippocampus. The hippocampus is a region of the brain that we know is involved in learning and memory, spatial navigation, but it's particularly involved in helping us sort of encode and process background contextual information as we navigate through the world. And what we actually saw is that the degree to which kids were activating this area in the hippocampus while they were looking at those faces embedded within scenes, the better they did on that memory test outside the scanner. So the more you activate this area in the hippocampus, the better you were able to remember the pairings of faces with background scenes. So how does exposure to violence impact this process? So what we found, again, was something very specific. We found that kids who had been exposed to abuse and violence were performing worse at this memory test, but only if the face that they were looking at was angry. Okay, so angry faces are a very reliable threat cue. When someone is angry, that's a pretty certain cue that something dangerous could happen. So only in the presence of that threatening cue were the kids who had been exposed to violence performing worse on this memory test. And it turns out that, again, specifically, just when the face was angry, they were recruiting this brain region, the hippocampus, that we know is important for this task, less than kids who had never experienced violence. And they weren't just recruiting the hippocampus less, they were actually activating a totally different network of brain regions. So sometimes in MRI, we're interested not just in one brain region, but in how multiple brain regions are kind of working together to perform a particular kind of cognitive or emotional function. And what we saw is that kids who had never experienced violence were recruiting a network that we know is involved in memory, working memory, holding things in mind for a short period of time. But in contrast, kids who had been exposed to abuse were activating this region in kind of the lower or ventral and lateral part of the prefrontal cortex that we know is involved in orienting to threat. When there's a threat in the environment, this region of the brain becomes active and it shifts your attention to focus on that threat. So we were interested, is recruitment of this different network predicting how well the kids performed on this task? And in fact, it did. It was a very strong predictor. So the more the kids were using this alternative kind of threat-orienting brain network, the worse they were able to remember those faces outside the scanner if the face was angry when they were trying to remember. So what does this mean? So the basic idea is that if you have grown up in an environment that's dangerous and you see something like this, an angry face, something threatening, your attention is going to hone in like a laser beam on this threat. And it's going to come at the expense of you processing the background context around you. Now, of course, this context is very important for helping us to modulate our emotions, right? And so this might explain why kids who have been exposed to violence often exhibit persistent fear, even in contexts where they've never experienced danger, because they're just less able to use that background context to shape their behavior and emotions because they're not paying attention to it. They're paying attention to the threat that's right in front of them. Now, I want to emphasize again that these adaptations, being highly attuned to threats in the environment and preferentially focusing on predictors of threat, this is an adaptive response. If you were growing up in an environment that's characterized by danger, you want your brain to do this. So I want you to take away, not that these kids' brains there's something wrong with them, not at all. These kids are adapting to the context they're in, and they're shifting their information processing in exactly the way they need to stay safe. But we also know that these patterns of brain activity can have long-term implications for these kids' mental health and their ability to be successful in life. So we had a unique opportunity to look at what these patterns of brain activity might predict in the long term about these kids' success. So in that first study I showed you, where we simply showed kids emotional images, that was a study that I conducted while my lab was still in Boston. And while we were midway through the study, a terrorist attack happened in Boston. Most of you probably remember this. There were 2 bombs that were detonated at the finish line of the Boston Marathon. Multiple spectators were killed, and hundreds of people were injured. And so in the ensuing days after this event, the city of Boston was really in a state of kind of heightened alert and heightened threat. News outlets widely circulated rumors about other bombs in the city. There were National Guards stationed throughout the public transportation system, and a large area of downtown Boston was roped off as a crime scene. A few days after the bombing, the FBI released photographs of the suspected perpetrators, and really an unprecedented event in modern America history happened, which is that the entire city of Boston was closed down for a day. In the middle of the week, schools were closed, public transportation was closed. Essentially, everyone was indoors, glued to CNN, watching this kind of high-speed chase unfold for the perpetrators of this incident. And we know that exposure to this kind of information in the media, even if you weren't standing at the finish line where the bombs were detonated, simply seeing about this kind of dangerous, threatening, frightening information is enough to trigger symptoms of PTSD in children and in adolescents. So post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, is a mental health problem where people have kind of intrusive thoughts and memories about something very scary that they experienced. They tend to avoid things that remind them about what happened. They have a lot of negative thoughts and emotions. They can have difficulty sleeping, concentrating, and feel very kind of on edge and hypervigilant. And what we found is actually that, remember that first finding I showed you where maltreated kids had greater activation in the amygdala? We found that the more you activated your amygdala to those negative images, so the more that you're sounding that alarm bell when you see something negative in the environment, the more likely you were to develop PTSD symptoms specifically related to this novel traumatic stressor that happened to everyone in the Boston area. Okay, which suggests that while these patterns of brain activity may be helping kids adapt in the short term, they come at a cost, and they're predicting higher likelihood of mental health problems down the line. Okay, so let me give you kind of a brief interim summary. So we see that kids who have been exposed to violence have greater amygdala reactivity to negative emotional cues, negative things in the environment, that when they're trying to regulate their responses to those cues, to modulate the intensity of their negative emotions, they have to use kind of more real estate in the prefrontal cortex to do it, which suggests it's harder for them, it's more effortful. That when there's a threat in the environment, these kids are kind of unable to take in information about the background context. And they exhibit brain differences in an area called the hippocampus that helps us to learn about where we are in the environment and use that information to modulate our behavior. And together, these changes in the brain appear to place children at risk for developing anxiety and PTSD later. Okay, so I want to switch gears. And for the rest of the talk, I'm going to talk about a very different kind of adversity. So I've shown you about some of the effects of growing up in an environment that's characterized by danger and by violence. But now I'm going to talk to you about what we've learned about growing up in an environment that's characterized by deprivation. And when I say deprivation, I mean an environment that's lacking in consistent cognitive stimulation, interactions with adults, and kind of complexity and learning opportunities in the environment. This is an environment that is common among kids who grow up in orphanages, which is at least 10 million children around the world, children who are neglected, and even children who grow up in poverty. This is the kind of environment you'll remember at the beginning that Sarah is being raised in. So what exactly do I mean by deprivation and cognitive stimulation and complexity? Let me make this real concrete. So this is seminal work by Hart and Risley, which showed that among children in the United States, by the age of 4 years, children growing up in poverty, on average, have heard 30 million fewer words. 30 million, take that in, 30 million fewer words than kids who are growing up in middle-class families. And this is just one simple example of the kind of deprivation I'm talking about, where your brain is not getting the kinds of stimulation from the environment that it sort of expects to develop normally. Other kinds of deprivation include a lack of stimulation from consistent interactions with adults, lack of enriching experiences either in the home or at school, and lack of consistent rules, routines, and structures, all of which are things our brain kind of expects from the environment as we're developing. So how does deprivation impact the brain? One of the things we learned about when inputs to the brain are lacking in sensory areas, like if you blindfold animals early in development and don't let any light come into the eye, we've learned that one of the primary ways through which experience shapes the development of the brain is by pruning away of synaptic connections that we produce way too many of early in development, and then sort of get rid of through the rest of life based on our experience. This is one of the ways that experience molds the brain over time. And the basic idea is that there are a lot of inputs that our brain is expecting from the environment. We expect light to come into our eyes, we expect sound waves to come into our ears, we expect to hear language, and there's a lot of synaptic connections that are created to process those inputs. And when those inputs are absent, our brain says, okay, this connection, I don't really need it, I'm gonna prune it away. And so what you can see here is kind of a diagram of how this happens across development in the human brain. Early on, for the first few years of life, there's this proliferation of connections between different neurons in the brain. And then really for the rest of our lives, these connections are being pruned away. And essentially what the system is doing is it's becoming more efficient and more effective for the environment in which it's developing. It's getting rid of things it's not utilizing. It's getting rid of pathways that are inefficient to create kind of the most effective information processing system for the environment in which it's developing. And we can actually remarkably see this process of synaptic pruning when we look at measures of gray matter volume in the human brain, where you see a very similar pattern of an increase early in life that's followed by a decrease throughout the rest of the life. So we're all on this trajectory here, right? Our brains are getting smaller, but that's not a bad thing. When it happens in a normal way, our brains are becoming more efficient. We're getting rid of stuff we don't need to process information effectively. However, this process, this normal process of synaptic pruning, can be hijacked by an environment that is lacking in input that our brains are expecting. So I'll first give you an example of sensory deprivation, because this is kind of where we learned about how this process works. So studies of visual deprivation in animal models, this is actually kind of heart-wrenching. They would put blindfolds on kittens for the first few months of life and kind of see what happened to their visual system. And what happened is that the synaptic connections throughout the visual cortex in the back of the brain weren't getting utilized, and the brain just got rid of them. The brain said, I'm not using this, I don't need it, I'm going to get rid of it. So you saw this early and extreme synaptic pruning that once it's gone, it's very difficult to kind of get those connections back later. And you actually see a similar pattern in studies, especially early in development, when humans are born blind and there's no input coming to the eye. You see dramatic thinning in visual cortex. So what that means is the synapses that are getting pruned away, when you have that happening on a massive scale, your brain actually gets thinner. The gray matter in the brain shrinks. And so this is what happens with sensory deprivation. So what about the kinds of social and cognitive deprivation that we study, like kids who are neglected? So on the top panel here, you can see what we think is going on in a typical developmental environment, where there's lots of stimulation in the environment. Lots of different neurons are kind of connecting and communicating with each other as the child learns and hears complex language, interacts with an adult. And this is how the cortex develops. Now, in contrast, down here, you can see an environment where a child is not hearing a lot of language, not having a lot of interaction with adults, not getting a lot of this kind of learning and stimulation from the environment. And so in the places where these neurons should be kind of communicating, when they are not communicating so much, the brain says, you know what, this connection, I'm not using it, I'm just going to get rid of it. And when that happens on a wide scale, the cortex itself becomes thinner. And this kind of folded gray matter that we have on the outside of the brain actually gets smaller. Okay, so let me show you some data to suggest that this is how early deprivation impacts the brain. I'm going to show you just one piece of data from a study that you're going to hear a lot about in just a few minutes with our second lecture. This study is called the Bucharest Early Intervention Project, a really innovative innovative study led by Chuck Nelson, who we're lucky enough to hear from next, along with Charlie Zena and Nathan Fox. This was a study of almost 150 infants and toddlers who were living in extremely deprived orphanage settings in Bucharest, Romania. Half of the kids were randomized to be placed in foster care, so to be removed from that deprived environment and placed in family environments. And I'm not going to talk much about this, but Chuck will tell you all about it. And a group of children who were growing up in the neighborhoods where these orphanages were located. Now, I'm going to show you just a piece of data where we assessed brain development using structural MRI in these children when they were 8 to 10 years old. But first, I want to just say one sort of thing about the nature of deprivation in this environment. So these kids are isolated. They have little interactions with adults. The number of children to adults is very high. So they have very little consistent interaction with caregivers. The caregivers tend to have low investment in the kids because they work rotating shifts. They don't take care of the same children all the time. And there's too many children for every adult. And the environment really lacks cognitive stimulation. These children rarely hear language, especially language that's directed to them, which we know really facilitates learning early in development. And the environment is highly routinized, which you can kind of see in this heartbreaking picture here. So the kids didn't only, have meals at the same time every day and have playtime at the same time every day. And they even are kind of forced to go to the bathroom all together at the same time. The environment is highly routinized. There's not a lot of individualized care. So we studied the brains of these children, again, using MRI, but instead of functional MRI, which I've been telling you about, which looks at how the brain is activating, we used structural MRI, which lets us measure the size of different areas of the brain. So I just briefly want to describe how this works. So basically, this is how the brain looks to MRI. When you're doing a structural MRI, essentially what it does is it says it takes the brain and breaks it into these tiny little cubes that we call voxels. And it says, is it white or is it gray? That's basically what MRI is doing. It's remarkably simple at that level. The white matter are the axons, the projections from one neuron to another. And the gray matter, which I'm going to talk about, includes the neurons themselves, the dendrites, and all the synaptic connections between the neurons, the things that we think get pruned away in the absence of stimulation from the environment. So how does this kind of early deprivation impact the structure of the developing brain? Consistent with this idea that an environment lacking in stimulation and consistent interaction with adults is going to lead to extreme and early synaptic pruning, we found that these are the groups of kids who grew up in this early deprived environment. These are kids growing up in families in the community. We find a drastic reduction in gray matter volume across the entire cortex. Again, the cortex is the folded part of the brain on the outside. So the cortex is smaller. But we're most interested in this measure of cortical thickness. So the cortex is actually not very thick, just a few millimeters. And the measure that we think most closely reflects synaptic pruning is how thick the cortex is. So what I'm showing you here, areas in blue, are areas where the kids who grew up in this deprived environment have thinner cortex than the kids who grew up in a typical family environment. There are no regions of the brain that are thicker in these children. So what we see is really a widespread pattern of cortical thinning. We see that it's most pronounced in areas of the brain that process language, areas in the prefrontal cortex that we know are involved in emotion regulation and executive functioning, and regions throughout the parietal cortex that are involved in functions like memory and attention. So does this matter? So what are the implications of this pattern of accelerated cortical thinning that we're observing in kids who grow up in this deprived environment? So critically, we observe a similar pattern among kids who are exposed to this early deprivation in cognitive tasks that rely on those areas of the brain that we're thinning too quickly. So when we give them tasks of working memory, essentially show them something, have it go away and ask them to remember to sort of match to which one of these things they just saw, they perform much worse. And when we give them tasks involving planning, so to think about a strategy for solving a problem before they solve it, they also perform much worse. These are regions we know rely on the prefrontal cortex and the parietal cortex, those areas that we're thinning faster. And more critically, perhaps, we also see a very similar pattern in levels of ADHD. In fact, kids who grow up in orphanages, not just in this study, but in many studies, have been shown to have levels of ADHD that are 4 to 5 times higher than kids who are growing up in families in the community. And so we were curious about whether this accelerated pattern of cortical thinning might explain why we see this very high rate of ADHD in these children. And so, in fact, what we found is that the relationship between early deprivation, growing up in this orphanage, and symptoms of inattention, a core feature of ADHD, about 2/3 of that association was explained by these atypical patterns of brain development. Now, a way you can think about this is that if we could alter this trajectory of brain development by changing the environment, we could reduce symptoms of ADHD by 65% in these kids. And more strikingly, when we looked at symptoms of hyperactivity, the other core feature of ADHD, we actually found that these atypical patterns of brain development explained about 80% of that relationship. Again, suggesting that if we could change this trajectory in some way, we could theoretically prevent or reduce about 80% of hyperactivity symptoms in these kids. So you may be thinking to yourself, okay, how many kids are really raised in these terrible orphanage settings? Maybe not so many. What about other deprived environments, though? And what we see is actually that kids growing up in deprived environments here in the United States actually exhibit very similar patterns of brain development. So I'm just going to show you one example. And I'm going to talk about kids who are growing up in poverty. So we know that about 20%, actually 25% now, of kids in the United States are growing up in a family that's below the federal poverty line. And growing up in a family with low income or with low parental education is associated with, it's not a one-to-one predictor, but it's associated with a variety of kinds of deprivation. So I showed you early on the findings regarding complex language. Kids get remarkably lower levels of language stimulation early in development. They experience material deprivation, so inconsistent access to food and shelter, and far fewer enriching cognitive experiences in the home and outside the home, as well as supervision by adults. And what's remarkable, this is actually data that's not from my lab. This is from Allison Mackey's lab, who is now at Penn. She has shown a remarkably similar pattern of reductions in cortical thickness among kids right here in the United States who are growing up in poverty. Now, this map looks a little different. These blobs are bigger because of differences in how the statistics were calculated. But what you can see is that the areas of the brain where you're seeing this accelerated thinning are very similar to the patterns I just showed you among the kids growing up in those orphanages. That growing up in poverty here in the United States seems to be impacting the trajectory of how the brain is developing in a similar way, although it's certainly less extreme. But all of these areas that you see in red and yellow are areas that are thinner in kids who are growing up in poverty than among kids who are growing up in middle-class families. So to summarize, we see that exposure to deprivation is associated with this accelerated cortical thinning across many areas of the brain, but in particular, regions of the brain that support complex cognition like memory, attention, and language, decision-making. We think that this accelerated thinning is reflecting a process where the brain is pruning away connections that are not getting utilized because the environment is not stimulating. And that this accelerated cortical thinning leads to reduced performance on a whole variety of complex cognitive tasks. I just showed you a few, but there are many domains, especially in the domain of language and in the domain of what we call executive functioning, being able to hold things in mind, think about the future, make good decisions. These are all areas that are strongly impacted by deprivation and by the brain areas where we see accelerated thinning. And these changes in the brain appear to place children at risk for developing ADHD and other types of behavior problems later in development. So I want to end on a more positive note. I think that the work that I've been showing you, the integration of brain science with understanding the impacts of diversity, really has the potential to lead us to the next critical step in this field, which is to use the neuroscience methods to improve interventions for children who are growing up in adversity. So I want to highlight 2 examples of how I think neuroscience can be useful in this regard. So the first example is in relation to the work I first showed you on threat. In particular, I showed you that cognitive reappraisal thinking about something in a different way, to change its emotional meaning, can modulate the degree to which your amygdala is responding to things in the environment. Now remember, the amygdala is this kind of alarm bell that we see going off way stronger in kids who have grown up in dangerous environments compared to kids who haven't. So we see that teaching kids, even in a simple MRI experiment, how to use cognitive reappraisal leads these kids to be able to modulate their amygdala very effectively. And we know that this kind of cognitive reappraisal strategy, this is kind of a cornerstone of many of our evidence-based treatments, including something we call trauma-focused cognitive behavior therapy, which is a side note is something else that people here in the psychology department at UW, including Shannon Dorsey, study. How do we get kids this effective treatment that we know works? And I think what the neuroscience suggests is that these kinds of strategies that we often don't use until kids have shown up in a clinic exhibiting a lot of problems with anxiety and fear could actually be used as a preventive strategy. After kids have been exposed to trauma, using this kind of reappraisal could actually prevent the onset of mental health problems later. And we don't know if this is true. This is entirely speculation on my point, but just something I think could be an important future direction. But something that's not speculation, a second example, this is actually also a study from Allison Mackey's lab, where they used neuroscience, and what we've learned about the neuroscience of poverty in particular, to think about delivering and developing very brief interventions for kids growing up in poverty to try to boost some of these complex cognitive skills that we know are impacted by these atypical patterns of brain development. So in this study, it was a very brief intervention. Kids came to an after-school program twice a week for 8 weeks, and they worked with basically a graduate student who played games with them. But they were special kinds of games. They were games that were designed to specifically target certain kinds of cognitive processes. So some of the kids were trained in reasoning skills, how to think critically about problems, and some of the kids played games that were focused on processing speed, processing information as quickly as you could to win. And what you saw just after 8 weeks, twice a week for 8 weeks, with a graduate student is that the kids who are trained in reasoning improved significantly on a standard test of reasoning ability. This is actually a test that's part of an IQ test, after 8 weeks, whereas kids who are trained in the processing speed showed significant increases in their ability to process complex information quickly. And I think that these findings suggest that brief interventions, if they're targeting the right cognitive and brain mechanisms, can have really dramatic effects on children's development. And this is just the beginning of the types of innovative thinking we need to improve our interventions to help children like Michael and Sarah and the hundreds of millions of other children growing up around the world in areas plagued by violence and poverty. And I truly believe that brain science can help to create these innovations to help these children develop and lead more successful lives. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There's lots of interesting points to follow up on. So we do have a few minutes for questions. If you don't mind going to, I think there's a mic right there in the aisle. If you don't mind going to the mic so that we can hear. And there's another mic in that other aisle. We'll take a few questions.
So you mentioned that like in the Boston Marathon, people get kind of partially traumatized by seeing it on TV. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering how far things like violent movies and video games where you shoot things and get shot feed into any of this, or have you thought about that? Or is there an ability people discount that so the effect is much smaller? Or how does violence on the screen feed into all this?
That's a really interesting question. And I think there's actually a large body of literature on this in psychology now, which suggests that kids who are exposed to violence in television shows and in video games are more likely to behave in ways that are aggressive. So they kind of get exposed to things where they see a lot of aggression. They're more likely to behave aggressively. Now, that effect is probably is small, right? It's not like playing a violent video game and suddenly you're out on the street beating people up. But we think probably chronic exposure to that or too much exposure to violence in television and video games is not great for children's development.
That's a great question. Yeah. One more.
Does trauma in adults have a similar effect, young adults and adults?
Yes, that's a great question. There's actually a fair amount of work now that shows that exposure to trauma in adulthood has similar impacts on the brain as exposure to trauma in childhood, but those effects tend to be smaller. So kind of one of the ways to think about this is that early in development, the brain is incredibly plastic. And we retain that plasticity throughout our lives. We're constantly able to learn new things from the environment and change, but that change is happening much more rapidly early in development. And we think that that brain plasticity that happens early on, at least partially, is really driven by the environment that kids are developing in. The brain is kind of tuning itself to be kind of as efficient and effective as possible for the environment you're growing up in. And so it's particularly attuned to what's going on around you. And so during this period of rapid development early in life, when the brain is really sensitive to the environment, we see that these kinds of stressful and adverse experiences have a particularly pronounced effect on how the brain's developing. It's not qualitatively different, but it's a much bigger effect than we tend to see in adulthood.
Okay, we'll have time for, we'll just take 1 and 2 more questions. So one over here.
Thank you very much for your talk and work. Is there any evidence to show that the cognitive behavioral therapy is more or less effective if the child cannot be removed or can be removed from the environment that has so many adverse experiences?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think one of the principles of cognitive behavior therapy for trauma is that the most important thing, before you can really teach kids to think about things in a different way and to learn how to kind of modulate their reactions to things, is that the environment has to be safe. Right? And that's kind of the first principle that we work from when we use interventions like CBT, is that you work with the parents to the degree possible to make sure that the kid is actually in a safe environment before trying to change these strategies that we know are there to help keep them safe. And so one of the things that can be challenging is working with kids where even if maybe they're in a, the home environment is now safe, they're in a dangerous neighborhood, or they continue to be exposed to violence, but even in those contexts, cognitive behavior therapy is still quite effective. And it really focuses on helping kids figure out when do you need to pay attention to those alarm bells and when not. So that idea of context that I brought up, teaching kids to know when it's important to pay attention to that alarm bell and to not kind of reappraise, but to really pay attention to real danger cues and how to distinguish them when you're in environments that are safe.
Thank you, Katie. Sherry.